going on? It was a moment of intense or heightened political repression. Activists were getting killed or disappeared every single day. So that I would say that NUPL, when the founding members gathered and decided to put up this organization, the organization was born in a crucible of state violence, and they thought it was necessary to come up with an organization that would facilitate services for victims of grave human rights violations. But like I was saying, they made a simple observation that the people who needed legal representation the most are those who cannot afford them. And these very people are the ones that other lawyers would avoid, unfortunately, because they're involved in highly politically sensitive cases that would put them in the line of fire, literally. Because based on our experience, our members have been subjected to red tagging, surveillance, various forms of threats and intimidation, which have migrated from offline to online, especially in social media, because I was so impressed by him, really. And then I was about to graduate, and I was really at the crossroads, still deciding what would I do with my life? Would I go full time? What is there for me? So at the same time, my father was illegally terminated from his job. So him and his co-workers, they filed a case with the National Labor Relations Commission, and he would come home with pleadings from that office, which I wish at the time I understood. So I thought there must be a way by which we could help people like him. And then I met Medical Minari. So, it was a convergence or confluence of events. And a friend of mine, when I met her, brought me an application form for the aptitude examination, College of Law in UP. That's where I graduated, by the way. So I took it up and I thought, okay, let's see. So then I heard that NPO was founded in 2007 before Emily was born. What I would be the simple answer is why did you find it possible? Some things would be with us. Thanks. Sige. Now that's better. Okay. Sorry, because I need to give the floor to my colleague. The simple answer is once you see injustice, it's really hard to look away. You know, it would eat away at my conscience if I don't do this, knowing that I have the skill, I know the reality very well. So here I am, 11 years later.
So it was a bit different for my part because I was born to a family of activists. My mother was a member of Gabriela, and then she later became a labor organizer. My father worked with faith-based organizations. During martial law, they organized rallies. They organized protest actions against the Marcos dictatorship. And later, he became a human rights worker, an investigator in the field, and in general, a human rights activist under Karapatan and the different networks that work on violations in the context of armed conflict. So I was fortunate enough that at an early stage, I was exposed to perspectives that you would say did not, yeah, okay. So I'm sorry for those who feel a bit hot because we have to turn off the fan. I hope my answer would make up for it. Anyway, so I was fortunate enough that at an early age, I was exposed to perspectives that ensured that I would not merely be accepting narratives. I would not be merely accepting the rules as they are, that I would challenge them and see whether they are correct, whether they are just. And joining NUPL was really more of a natural step. Of course, my parents never obligated me to join any organization, but since I became a member of the League of Filipino Students when I was in college, I was encouraged to think critically. And so joining NUPL was a natural step because NUPL gives you the opportunity to actually work with marginalized sectors, to take on cases that, as Josa said, other lawyers normally would not because of the political ramifications of the dangers that are involved. So to answer Gordon's first question about what NUPL work is like, what being a people's lawyer is like, we handle cases that are, well, these are pro bono cases. We don't get paid for them. We handle cases for those people who need assistance because their rights have been violated, whether it's political rights, civil rights, or socioeconomic rights. And more importantly, we advocate on broader issues. We do not limit ourselves to specific cases. We make sure that political and economic structures that create injustices in the country that lead to different acts of repression are also themselves being challenged.
Wonderful. So you just mentioned taking on political and economic structures. And earlier, Noreen, I think, mentioned that NUPL had taken on the case of Mary Jane Veloso. Really, for those of us overseas and in the US, has really become the name associated with the injustices of the labor export policy. So we would love to hear more about NUPL's work with Mary Jane Veloso and her family, and also hear a bit about the Philippine government's kind of response to her case and what kind of support or not support they've given.
Actually, Mary Jane's case is my very first with NUPL. I was signing the role when we heard news that she was about to be executed by firing squad in this execution island in Indonesia. And right before there was a formal complaint for human trafficking against her illegal recruiters, we were campaigning together with Migrante and many other organizations. We were able to gather we managed a miracle because at the 11th hour, right before she was about to be executed, President Joko Widodo granted her reprieve. And that was a long time ago, 2015. I remember sharing this story plenty of times and calling it my baptism of fire because even before I appeared in court, my client was about to die. So deep inside, I was crying, especially while we were marching towards a vigil in front of the Indonesian embassy. So I thought, my very first client is about to die. I mean, why? Why would that happen? So ever since, we have persevered in getting her illegal recruiters convicted for their crimes. We managed to do that in 2019, but for their other victims. Apparently, they were engaged in that scheme, no, for quite some time, and they would victimize vulnerable women, young mothers, poor young mothers in their community, and recruit them to non-existent jobs in Southeast Asia. So they were caught at the time, around the time that Mary Jane was about to be executed, and human trafficking cases eventually filed against them. But the wheels of justice, as we have always said, grind very slowly in the Philippines. Just imagine 2015. And what year are we in already? No? She's been at the death row for so many years until Indonesia decided to repatriate her to the Philippines in, when was that? 2 years ago? No, 2 years ago. We were ecstatic that finally she'll be able to see her family in Philippine soil and that she has been removed formally from death row. But you know what? The Philippine government continued to incarcerate her. It doesn't make sense for any lawyer and for any non-lawyer for a person to not have any charge against her in a Philippine court, to not have been convicted for any in any criminal action, but still languish in jail. So it was very difficult for her to accept her fate. She really felt and she really hoped that she was going to be released, just like the other prisoners from, I think it was in Australia, no, that repatriated, but then the government granted them clemency and released them. So the same thing did not happen, unfortunately, for Mary Jane. So she continued to hope, and so did we. We continued to campaign for her. And for her release, no, by urging the president, Bongbong Marcos, to grant her clemency or pardon, which under the Philippine Constitution, under Philippine law, only he could do. But we have not succeeded so far, but we have not given up at the same time. So last year in November, we filed a petition for habeas corpus. This is for non-lawyers, this is the remedy for persons who are undergoing illegal confinement, no, in the hands of government. So what is strange here is that the Philippine Supreme Court has not acted on that petition for a long time. That's why we filed a motion for resolution during Mother's Day in May, and where we attach a handwritten letter and appeal personally from Mary Jane, stating that she's hoping that the Supreme Court would act on it. She would not discuss the merits of her case, but she believes, no, that she is unfairly and unlawfully being held in the correctional institution for women. And I would just would like to share how she is now, because you might be wondering, when she arrived 2 years ago and was detained at the CIW, that's in Manila, in Mandaluyong City, she was utterly shocked because she could see the world of difference in treatment in Indonesia and in the Philippines. In Indonesia, the focus really, I saw it firsthand when I visited her at the penitentiary. The focus was on rehabilitation. But here in the Philippines, the conditions are utterly inhuman. I don't know if you've seen our prisons here in the Philippines. Congested. No? So many people are crowded in a single cell. So she was utterly shocked. And of course wanted to be released. And she would always worry about her parents who had to travel from a province in Luzon, it's in Nueva Ecija, just so they could see her. So the daughter in her and the mother in her, no, she never changed. She would always be concerned about her finances. And you know what? She acquired a lot of skills in Indonesia. She knows how to paint already. She plays the piano. She plays in a band. She plays the guitar. She knows how to make batik. And she, yeah, with her with her skills, she's able to raise some funds. Not a lot, no, but she's able to give some support to her children. But of course, ultimately, her wish is for her to be reunited with them outside of prison. So that's the update, no, that I can share about her case. And of course, this to be an emblematic case of the plight of Filipino migrant workers all over the world.
And when you think about the Veloso case, and this is, I think, where NUPL has an advantage as compared to other organizations. We try our best to go beyond the specifics of a particular case. We also always advocate on the context. So when you think about Mary Jane's case, we should not limit the discussion to the issue of drug trafficking or human trafficking and the possession of drugs, but ask ourselves what were the structural forces that forced Mary Jane and millions of other Filipinos to look for work abroad or to migrate. And most of you would know this, the Philippines is, as discussed earlier, a very rich country with a population that is mired in poverty. So for example, just to give you, those of you who may have an idea as an insight, the Philippine government says that only 15% of Filipinos are poor or live below the poverty line. And only 4.5% of Filipinos are unable to meet basic food needs. But that is because the Philippine government sets the poverty threshold at $1.64 per day per person. So the government is saying that if you earn $1.65, you are not poor. Okay? And of that amount, you have to divide that into the amount of, I would say, around 60% of that would address the food needs, and around 30+% of that would address electricity, transportation, education, food, other utilities, everything else. So that is the reason why, if you look at statistics, most Filipinos, a good majority of Filipinos, are actually pretty affluent. But the reality is that, according to statistics that I would say reflect more the actual facts on the ground, is that half of Filipino families rate themselves as poor. 3/4 of the entire population have no savings whatsoever. So they are vulnerable to in case of hospitalization or any other accident, for example, or any other disaster that may befall them, they are vulnerable to extreme poverty. And this is the situation that many Filipinos, out of desperation, this is the reason many Filipinos actually choose to go abroad. And that is the reason why NUPL cannot simply limit its advocacy to the facts of a specific case, but always to look at the broader context.
Thank you. Many of us here have been outraged to learn about the Filipino seafarers, cruise ship workers that have been deported from the ports of Baltimore and Norfolk. We have people online watching us now from Virginia Beach. And we've, taken our advocacy to the Philippine Embassy here in Washington, D.C. But what we've heard from Ambassador Romualdez is that Filipinos are not being targeted, that there is no issue, and only those who have committed a crime are being deported. Last December, some of those deported seafarers were able to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs and raise their issues, the fact that they had lost their livelihoods, they had been smeared, blacklisted from the agencies. So I think for those of us here, we're wanting to learn more about your work in the Philippines and on the case of Veloso, more about, what is, the response and the support of the Philippine government more. So you mentioned that Marcos has not acted on the clemency, the Supreme Court has also not acted on it. But I know under Duterte, they established the Department of Migrant Workers. So if you could speak more, we have an entire department dedicated towards overseas Filipinos, who I think make up some 10% of the population. So I don't know if you could speak more to the Philippine government's response.
Well, that's true. Under Duterte, an entire department was actually created to focus on this particular sector. And I'm sure everybody knows that the Philippine economy is actually heavily reliant on income from Filipinos working and living abroad. So what is extremely unfortunate is that when these Filipinos find themselves in legal trouble, for example, all the government or the Philippine government can extend is minimal help. And despite the existence of a department dedicated to this sector, we have not seen any structural reforms in the country that would actually encourage or uplift the lives of Filipino migrant workers, particularly their families, in order to encourage them to come home or to remain in the Philippines and secure employment there. For me personally, having a large sector of the population go abroad and secure employment and assist their families back home in directly assisting or increasing or improving the economy, that may have a beneficial impact in the short term, but you could just imagine the toll that it creates for these families who have to be separated for years, even decades. Some of these Filipino workers abroad have never seen their children grow up, and that is heartbreaking. And the only way that you can address such a situation is that if you create or embark on structural reforms that would actually allow them to find jobs in their own country. That should be the long-term solution. But what the government has done with the creation of this new department, with the infusion of new policies and programs that are supposedly intended to help Filipino migrant workers, is simply to facilitate their exit from the country, to ensure that it becomes easier for other countries to exploit Filipino labor. It becomes easier for Filipino migrant workers to send their money back home without actually addressing the root causes of the problem, the reason why they had to leave in the first place. That is, I'm sorry to say, simply another way of exploiting this particular sector. And I, for one, hope that someday we will find a way to actually provide for jobs that can enable these families to live a better life and allow Filipino workers to remain home with their families without the need to actually go abroad. Unless, of course, they want to travel or they really want to work abroad, that would be great. But we need good paying jobs back home instead of forcing Filipino workers to actually travel abroad.
Thank you. Now, in the case of Mary Jane Veloso, we have the issue of drug possession, misuse of the law. But we also saw the case of migrant workers, right? And that Department of Migrant Workers was established under Rodrigo Duterte. Now, I would like to hear more about NUPL's work with the families and the victims of Duterte's drug war. People in the audience, might have heard last year Duterte was arrested and taken to The Hague to await trial for crimes against humanity with the International Criminal Court. And for those watching news in the Philippines this past month, the Philippine Senate has become a circus. First with, the chasing of Senator Bato de la Rosa, the former chief of the Philippine National Police, Duterte's right-hand man, and now this clash between the two different factions in the Senate, the pro-Duterte and the pro-Marcos, that seems to have really been shaken up by the arrest of Duterte. But would love to hear more about the impacts on the clients and the victims of his drug war.
We are assisting the victims under this organization called Rise Up for Life and for Rights. It's a coalition of various civil society organizations, including faith-based ones, that gathered victims and assisted them in various ways. We have Rise Up has provided not only legal support from NUPL, but also other support services. In 2018, the filing of cases of complaints with ICC began. And I'm sure you have heard that the Duterte government has tried to frustrate these proceedings at every turn. from preliminary examination to investigation, and then Duterte filed these various applications for relief, for example, for interim release. What else? He challenged the jurisdiction of the ICC in the first place because, as you know, the Philippines withdrew, and that withdrawal from the Rome Statute became effective in March 2019. And one of their fundamental objections to the case is that the Rome Statute, the ICC no longer has any jurisdiction over them because we're no longer a member. But the thing is, we are a former member. And that means, that entails obligations on the part of the Philippine government that still linger even if it is no longer a member. We call that residual obligations that include cooperation with ICC in terms of acquiring jurisdiction over the person of the perpetrators and the co-perpetrators in this case. In other words, ensuring that they will be arrested and brought to The Hague to face trial. So right now, the status is there is one perpetrator already committed at The Hague, that's Duterte. And I would say that of course, the journey or the path leading to that important moment in the case has been long and arduous. The victims were elated, of course, when they learned that Duterte had been arrested and flown there by the Philippine representatives of the Philippine government now to face trial, and of course that charges had been confirmed against him for murder and attempted murder following this common plan of killing suspected drug offenders, and ensuring impunity for their crimes. But all of this really is the result of the relentless or unrelenting, persevering efforts of the victims themselves. So we have given them assistance, we've been there. The victims, and their persistence, that led to this important stage, in the case. So we have always expressed our admiration for the mothers, the widows, the orphans who were not attacked, unfortunately. I will segue to the conditions on the ground in terms of what the victims are facing. And you may have noticed, I don't know if you have been looking at Facebook, especially after the Duterte arrest, the victims, and my colleague, Chrissy Conti, she's always on TV, you know her, she has attained rock star status already for being, a permanent fixture before Philippine media, even foreign media about this case. So, in every important moment, a critical stage in the proceeding, the victims and lawyers like Chrissy would face coordinated attacks online. Especially if you follow the confirmation of charges hearing, did you see the manipulated images of them that were circulated online? They were photographed outside The Hague carrying, of course, their personal belongings, which included some bags. And malicious actors manipulated the photos so expertly, I think they used AI there, to replace the bags, the no-brand bags that our clients were carrying with luxury ones. I think Chrissy's was Louis Vuitton, to make it appear that they are being funded by whoever to, smear and or to cause damage to the reputation of the Dutertes, to make them fall from grace further, after they are no longer in power. But now it's clear that the alliance between the Marcoses and the Dutertes is now broken, because before, you may have noticed during the service of the warrant against Duterte, they would claim, no, we're just cooperating with the Interpol. They would not really directly admit that it's cooperation with the ICC, because the political alliance is still uncertain at the time. But now it's clear, diba? The lines have been drawn, especially now with the impeachment proceedings against Sara Duterte that's about to happen at the Senate. And there are shenanigans, as Gordon mentioned. The Senate itself coddled one of the sitting senators, now a fugitive from justice, facing a warrant that had recently been unsealed after its issuance in November. He's at large, and I'm talking about Bato de la Rosa, one of the co-perpetrators who had been with Duterte for a long time, committing crimes under this common plan of killing suspected drug offenders and ensuring impunity for these crimes against humanity.
I also hope that nobody suffers under any illusion that suddenly the Marcos government has a newfound respect for international law. It's a matter of convenience for them right now because remember, after Marcos Jr. became president, he did everything within his power, his government, to derail the ICC proceedings. They requested that the proceedings be suspended. They asserted that the ICC had no jurisdiction. They were making the same points that the Duterte government was making years back. And it was only after this alliance had broken down that the Marcos government decided that it was convenient for them to make sure that the head of the Duterte clan would no longer be in the Philippines for the next elections. So it's not because the government is suddenly aware that it has responsibilities under international human rights law. It's not because they believe that they are those responsible for the drug war should be held accountable. It's not because they want to address the issue of impunity. They only want to have the Duterte faction and its allies in prison for political convenience. And the fact is that this war, the drug war, was implemented not simply through the actions of the Dutertes or their allies, it used the entire infrastructure of government. So the perpetrators are not simply those at the very top. You also have administrators, high-ranking and mid-ranking police and civilian officials that are still in power. And many of them are still working for the Marcos administration. The Marcos administration seems to be in no hurry. It is not making any effort to hold those officials accountable. The police are still there. These are the same units that implemented the drug war. So it is not because they want to seek accountability. It is simply because they are getting rid of a political opponent. And that is why the civil society, people's organizations rise up, other human rights advocates, their role is so important because they are the ones that are actually carrying the interests of the victims and their families.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier that you got involved during the time of the passage of the Human Securities Act under GMA. I was in diapers then, but I got involved during Duterte when he passed the Anti-Terrorism Act in 2020. And the year before, he had put together the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, which was carrying forward that same strategy of the drug war that brings so many different government agencies under the direction of this military policy. So I was wondering if you two could share more about the human rights record of the police and the military. I don't know, Vicky, if you could, share a bit more about your own experiences with state forces.
Counterinsurgency campaign in the Philippines right now, the framework that it has is what's called the whole of nation approach. We got it from, of course, the United States. It's merely an expansion of what is called the whole of government approach or the whole of state approach that the US has. It is essentially an expansion of what is called civil military operations. So whole of nation recognizes that an insurgency, a social movement, is rooted in the support of the population. If there are structural issues that lead to poverty, create injustices, the people will mobilize themselves. The state knows that. So counterinsurgency is geared towards suppressing that support. Of course, it targets rebel organizations, rebel groups, but counterinsurgency practitioners recognize the vital, the crucial role of the population. Whole of nation is intended to destroy that base of support. The problem with that is that you are erasing the distinction between combatants and civilians. We have seen that in counterinsurgency operations going back several decades because the Philippine government merely adopts the practices of other countries, particularly that of the United States. To this day, the United States trains Philippine security forces in counterinsurgency. Now, that results in widespread and systematic human rights violations. And the targets, as I said, civilians or civilian communities are activists or members of progressive organizations that are critical of government policies. So I'll give you an example. In my island, Panay, you have an indigenous community that is opposing the construction of a dam on its ancestral land. Government comes in, tries to secure what is called free, prior, and informed consent, which is a requirement under domestic and international law before you construct something on its ancestral land. The indigenous people refuse, so the government sends in hundreds of soldiers to be deployed in these villages. Now, those deployments were made under whole of nation approach. The outcome is that 6 months after the deployments, the government conducts a raid in these communities. They kill 9 leaders of these indigenous communities and they arrest 16 others. This is only one case of several in the Visayas area where I work. You've heard of the Toboso massacre, yes? That took place in Negros. Even before the Toboso killings, you have had a number of massacres committed by Philippine security forces against civilians and their communities. They were targeted not because they were combatants, but because they were members of people's organizations, they were activists, they were land rights defenders. So what we are seeing is an approach, a counterinsurgency approach by a government that targets not merely the armed components of a movement, but communities that they believe may be supportive of that movement. And that violates both domestic and international law. In my case, of course, apart from when NUPL decided to take on the case of this indigenous community, the Tumando, we assisted the families, we assisted them in trying to build up a case. We assisted those members of the community that were arrested. Unfortunately, we were also the subject of an attack. There was intense red tagging and I was subjected to an assault. I was going home one evening and a number of individuals attacked me and stabbed me repeatedly. Now, I was fortunate enough to survive that incident, but as Josa said, there are other human rights lawyers from NUPL who were similarly attacked in other areas that were not so fortunate. So it's a systematic campaign really to target civilians, to target progressive organizations, including human rights defenders like myself.
Yeah. The Anti-Terrorism Act is the current and main anti-terrorism law in the Philippines. But I would also like you to note that there is a previous one passed way back in 2012. It's called the Anti-Financing Terrorism Law, but it has a longer title. It has been there since 2012 and apparently has not been used a lot because this government, the Philippine government, needed a broader definition of terrorism under which it could implicate more progressive organizations that it wishes to target. So came 2020, if you remember, under the pandemic, in the Philippines, there were varying degrees of community quarantines. There was an enhanced one. There's a slightly more relaxed version. But the government noticeably prioritized the passage of this law more than anything, more than really addressing the health crisis at the time. It was railroaded in Congress. There were no exhaustive formal deliberations about the law. And as a consequence, when people learned of the draconian provisions, they poured to the streets and protested against the passage of that law. Many of them got arrested because the police would claim, since it is the pandemic, you're not allowed, your right to peaceably assemble is restricted. It's suspended right now, which isn't true. So they arrested a lot of activists at the time. So the law was enacted, soon it was implemented. The government lost no time and designated the Communist Party of the Philippines in the New People's Army, which it believes to be terrorist, because like I said, the definition is quite broad. It can cover, it conflates armed conflict with acts of terrorism. And virtually any act of advocacy, protest, and dissent, if you look at it, can be misinterpreted by authorities as terrorism. And that's our problem. That has exacerbated the effects of red tagging. Why? Because not only can you be vulnerable to prosecutions for terrorism, you can be detained without charges for up to 24 days. And more importantly, your assets can be frozen once you get designated as a terrorist. It's very difficult to get designated as a terrorist because that does not entail any respect for the fundamental right to due process. You're not entitled to due process at all or to any notice and hearing. Many of our clients who have been designated only found out in the news or upon checking the website of the Anti-Money Laundering Council or the ATC itself, the Anti-Terrorism Council. So you're not entitled to be notified of it.
Or when their accounts were frozen. Yeah.
Or when they try to transact or withdraw from their banks. That's the only time that they would be told, sorry, there's a freeze order on your property, on your bank accounts, that you cannot touch it. These funds are being held by the government because of designation. But what is egregious here is that the effects of designation has cast a wide net over individuals and groups that the government believes to be in the orbit of those organizations that it had designated, like the CPP and PA. For example, the Rural Missionaries of the Philippines. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's an inter-congregational religious organization in the Philippines. Many of its members are nuns. And while we were litigating the case of the many petitions against the constitutionality of the ATA before the Supreme Court, their accounts had been frozen. And they were forced to close their office in Manila. And they had not been able to send missionaries to the rural countryside, which could have provided literacy programs to poor children. They literally teach the children how to read and write, building small schools for them, teaching them about their human rights, things like those. So they have not been able to do that because their funds had been frozen. And unfortunately, the government filed eventually a case called a civil forfeiture proceeding. It's a way by which the government would seize permanently these funds from them, and they lost. So we had appealed that case to the higher courts. Another egregious example, Frenchie May Cumpio. I'm sure you know her, no? The community journalist from Tacloban. Right before she was arrested in February of 2020, she was receiving death threats. She was heavily surveilled. A bouquet of flowers were sent to her office by suspicious military-looking men. And she would always notice being tailed by men with buzz cuts, or obviously soldiers, no? Sending her the message that she had to stop what she was doing, her reportages about the military abuses in the region in Eastern Visayas. But she did not stop because she is a human rights defender. As a journalist, that has been her calling. So when she was arrested in Feb 2020, along with Mariel Domicil, who is a member of the Rural Missionaries of the Philippines, the police seized an item that is not among those listed in the search warrant. And I'm referring to money that they raised. They went to Manila previously to solicit funds from different NGOs, different offices, so that they could help the victims of Typhoon Haiyan in Eastern Visayas, particularly in the Samar and Leyte provinces in the Visayas. So the police forcibly took that funds and used it to trigger an investigation for terrorism financing, which they did not think of the first time. How did it come about? Because our lawyers in the region filed a motion for the release of those funds, as they had nothing to do with the crime listed in the search warrant, which is illegal possession of firearms and explosive. And you know that grenades and guns were planted in their bedroom. So they thought of it, oh, okay, the money was not listed in the inventory. The police did not declare it actually. So I think they were so incensed and angered by this legal move from our lawyers that they thought of a way to further repress Mariel and Frenchie. So hence came the terrorism financing case, and unfortunately, early this year, they were convicted. And the court believed the testimonies of the fake NPA members who falsely claimed to know them, that they were together in the mountains for some time. The court believed those testimonies more than Frenchie and Mariel's. And we are fighting it again, no, in a different appeal to the higher courts, no, along with the appeals to the favorable decision. In another parallel case, there's also a civil forfeiture because whenever there's a terrorism financing case, there's also almost always there's also a civil forfeiture proceeding. In that case, they lost at the lower court, but they won at the appellate court. See, it's the findings are quite anomalous. They won in the forfeiture case eventually, but got convicted in this case. And what's even more anomalous here is that they were actually acquitted of the illegal possession charge that gave rise to the terrorism financing case in the first place. So what I'm trying to point out is that the weaponization of law, what we call lawfare, has intensified because of the use of counterterrorism. The Philippine government found a potent tool by which it could crack down on civil society, especially on progressive elements like Frenchie, Mariel, the rural missionaries of the Philippines, who would provide services to marginalized communities that the government had failed for quite a long time. And I am raising this issue now because it's relevant to you, because these laws have an extraterritorial application. So virtually anyone suspected of committing terrorism beyond Philippine shores, against Filipino citizens, or foreigners in the Philippines committing that crime could be prosecuted for anti-terrorism violations. And now, Gordon, if it's okay, I'd also add that the government is also expanding this universe of repressive legislation, because now they already have a pending bill called the Anti-Terror Grooming Act, and a total of 10 bills now pending before the House and Senate called Countering Foreign Interference Act. Highly relevant to all of you, because it could implicate practically all manners of collaboration between Filipinos and non-Filipinos due to the overbread, the vagueness of these laws. This activity could be prosecuted under that very law should it be legislated later on. So
you're saying that this entire room is a room of terrorists?
we could all be called terror groomers, terrorism financiers, or terrorists.
And I just like to point out, in the case of Frenchie Mercurio and Domicile, the sole state witness is implicated in 17 other cases as well. And it's the same evidence that was used in the weapons possession that they were acquitted for, but that same evidence was used in the terrorism financing, of which they were found guilty. So same government, same evidence, two totally different outcomes in things.
Yes. There is a finding in the illegal possession case by the same judge that convicted them in the terrorism financing charge, saying that there is no evidence in the illegal possession case of any links to terrorist organizations. And in the Court of Appeals decision that reversed the forfeiture of the funds that were taken from them, the Court of Appeals even said that they are gainfully employed as a humanitarian worker and as a journalist, and that the government should be careful in naming them and branding them as terrorists. So you see, the conviction really is an aberration that we wish to correct in the higher courts. Although, of course, there are, just to be precise here, there are different thresholds of evidence, the civil case as compared to the criminal case. There are also other witnesses that were presented in the criminal case that were not presented in the civil case. But what we're saying is the use of fake witnesses, fabricated evidence, have been relied upon by the government for so long, and we are trying to fight it, finally put an end to it.
So, on this point of how the judicial system in the Philippines has been weaponized against dissent, we're talking a lot about abuses by the military. And one of the things that was so inspiring, is so inspiring about NUPL's work, is that you're not just stuck in offices in Manila, but a lot of your work is in the rural areas where those military abuses take place. So I wanted, we'd like to hear a bit more about, how these counterterrorism laws are impacting rural communities. You mentioned, part of Prince Cumpio's coverage was of militarization.
Exactly.
And maybe if you could speak more to the recent massacre in San Negros as well, and help us understand the political and economic structures that give rise to these human rights abuses in the countryside.
Maybe to speak a bit slightly about militarization. Well, I talked about whole of nation approach earlier, how soldiers are deployed to civilian communities. There are essentially two ways that the Philippine military creates a climate of fear in these communities. One is through extrajudicial killings or physical attacks, physical violence. The other is through threat and intimidation. Now you can do that by simply threatening these communities, discouraging them from participating in perfectly legitimate civil society activities. So when the soldiers are there, they explicitly tell residents that you should not join rallies, you should not engage in protests. That's very explicit. When they do, for example, when they participate in a protest action demanding for government subsidies for farmers, for example, the soldiers, because these activities are usually under surveillance, the soldiers would go to their homes, show their photos, inform them you were spotted in a protest action. You should stop this, or you will be red tagged, or you'll be included in what is called an order of battle or a blacklist. Now, for those who persist, they become the targets of physical violence, or they become the subjects of arbitrary arrest and detention. The easiest, the most common case that is built up against these farmers or activists working in rural areas, development workers, is illegal possession of firearms and explosives. Explosives particularly because it creates a non-bailable case. Bail is not a matter of right. You are detained for the duration of the trial. Now, it's very easy to plant a grenade. And when the soldiers come into your house, what they do is they arrest you, they plant the evidence, and then they take photographs, and then they file the case against you, and then it goes to court. There's even this one weird case that we're handling where the police alleged that the grenade was found on top of a stove. Now, who in their right mind would leave that item there? But still, the farmer was indicted. He is now in his 6th year in jail, and the prosecution and the trial is still ongoing. This goes into the other aspect of weaponization of judicial processes. Not only do these judicial processes or these legal processes rather allow the arrests to take place or the killings to take place, but even when a person is already in court or facing these charges in court, presumably you're supposed to have due process, the trials can last 5 years, 6 years. We have one case where trial has not ended at the 9th year, right? If you add appeal, you can be in jail for more than a decade, and your case would still be pending. Even if our clients are later acquitted, they would have spent a decade in jail. That is weaponization of the law. How long should a trial take in the Philippines? Under the law, under the rules, it should take 180 days. And yet we have cases that have lasted this long. Right now, the prisoner in Panay with the longest record is 7 years. The previous prisoner had 9 years, but he was later released. So it's not only the Philippine security forces that are responsible for this. We're talking about judges, we're talking about prosecutors, government lawyers that give the services that allow for incarceration under suspicious circumstances or dubious circumstances to take place. That is weaponization of the law. Of course, counterterrorism measures, that's another aspect of it. Right now, we are handling a case for one of our clients, Josephine Porquia. She's 64 years old. The government raided her home, claimed that she had improvised explosive devices in that house. Now, the warrant they used did not contain her name. It referred to another person. It had another name, another address. What the government did when we tried to get the case dismissed, the prosecutor simply said, well, this goes to trial, we'll just change the charging document. We'll change the name in the information. The other day, the government issued an order, said, yeah, it's a matter of right for the prosecution. Trial has not started yet. Even if the name in the warrant was not the client's name, we'll allow the amendment. That is weaponization of the law. And that is what is so frustrating about it. You are a legal practitioner. You are supposed to believe in these principles of law. And then you are confronted with such practices that allow injustices to take place.
So you've outlined several cases that are baffling, where common sense is totally thrown out the door. I think we could use some help understanding what's happening in the Philippines. Why is it that farmers are being charged with putting grenades on stoves, and elderly women are also being charged with harboring grenades and weapons in their home and financing terrorism? I mean, what is at the root of this kind of anti-terrorism charge, especially in rural communities like in Rosa and Panay?
Yeah, I'd like to give the example of the 4 activists belonging to the Cordillera People's Alliance. You may have been aware of their designation as terrorists. Stephen Tauli, Sara Aliquez, Wendell Bulingit, and Jennifer Awingan. They're all advocates of indigenous people's rights in the Cordilleras, which have also always been hotspots for development aggression projects that would displace various indigenous people's groups in the area. And because of their fierce resistance, they have always been the target of these forms of weaponization of law. Wendell Bulingit, for example, had been subjected to different cases: murder, frustrated murder, what else? Rebellion, all of them thrown out the door, dismissed, or he would be acquitted, exonerated on the merits, meaning after trial. But you know what? After some time, the Philippine government may have figured out that nothing is working, nothing is sticking among the charges that we're slapping him with. Why not just designate him? So that's what they did. They designated him as a terrorist. And what we did was file a petition to challenge that designation before the Baguio Regional Trial Court. But you could see the result: the designation, the malicious prosecutions, the baseless fabricated charges. These were all engendered by their fierce advocacy for their rights, their assertion of the right to self-determination, among other socioeconomic rights as indigenous peoples. So that would be an example. And we actually experienced some threats and intimidation while handling this case that I think is worth sharing to all of you, because I remember that during hearings, my colleagues and our clients would be surveilled by police officers, intelligence police officers in plain clothes. And one of them was actually hiding his firearm under his shirt. And he would even take photos of our lawyers and our clients in the courthouse. That's how brazen they are. But of course, our lawyers are equally, they're so brave. They literally ran after one of these police officers and caught him inside the police headquarters, and that's how they found out his identity. So I'm pointing this out because the insidious tactics are not limited to the filing of charges. They would also intimidate us in the very spaces where we try to seek justice. But unfortunately, we did not prevail in that case. Recently, the regional trial court came up with its decision denying our petition to nullify that designation, saying basically that since there is a sole witness that testified on seeing them in the mountains, in the company of the NPA, to the court that was enough, even if that testimony was not corroborated by someone credible, someone entirely independent of the military machinery. So yeah, that's just one example.
If we have time, maybe I can speak to Negros.
Yeah, please.
Negros is it's an emblematic place, or rather, it's a good example that captures what the Philippines is in general. It's a very poor province, but of course, you have a segment of the population that are hacienderos. They're very rich. They have luxury cars and everything. But the vast majority of people in Negros are farm workers. And they do not earn minimum wage. They earn much less than that. And that place has been, these people have been marred in poverty since time immemorial. And that is the reason that so many people in Negros actually take up arms. They join the New People's Army. They join the liberation movement in order to address these structural problems. Unfortunately, what the government is trying to do, instead of recognizing the root causes of conflict, instead of engaging in peace talks with the National Democratic Front, is simply to paint all armed resistance as terrorism. And in the process, they preclude any discussion into structural violence. They preclude any discussion into the reasons that these communities are taking up arms in the first place. And that is what the Philippine government wants to do. They would say that they would want all of us to look at these individuals, these organizations, as evil and no questions asked. So NUPL advocates for a recognition of the underlying causes of armed conflict, and it does so by supporting efforts to restart the peace talks between the National Democratic Front and the government of the Republic of the Philippines. Now, the other impact of using the counterterrorism narrative is that it deliberately puts a target on civilians and organizations that are not taking up arms, are not engaged in illegal acts, but may have the same perspectives as the National Democratic Front, but they do not engage in any form of violence. But as far as the Philippine government is concerned, that is still tantamount to supporting terrorism or terrorism-related activities. And that is the danger of a broad or expanded definition of terrorism. And as a result, so many extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances are taking place in Negros as well as in other regions, because the government does not distinguish between an activist that has the same principles as an organization that is actually taking up arms in order to address these structural issues. And that is what we hope could change. You cannot expect that change to come from the government. It has to be a grassroots movement. It has to be a social movement that allows the public to actually take a more nuanced approach when it comes to the counterterrorism narrative. Governments like to paint their opponents as evil, as terrorists, in order to avoid a discussion of the underlying issues that lead to armed conflict.
Thank you. So we're going to soon wrap up the moderated part of this discussion. So I'd like to let people know if you'd like to ask a question. We'll be taking 3 questions or so if we have time. But we'd ask you to line up over by Kyle here, who has the microphone. And, you know, while people, if they have questions and line up, I'd like to ask just one final question here, which is, it is amazing the work that NUPL does, and it is so clear why you know, we're awarded the Human Rights Award by the Kennedy Center. But I think what he'd like to know here is, how can we support from here in the DMV, from here in the US? What is it that you know, Americans and the overseas Filipino could do to support the work of NUPL, and more importantly, the work of your clients and helping defend them?
Yeah, I was asked the same question. I think 3 days ago before the ceremony, the awarding ceremony. And I answered in terms of material and non-material support. By material, you know what I mean. We provide services entirely pro bono. The wherewithal, the resources are always scarce. We rely on people's movements who provide support to us. So any way by which you can help sustain our continued advocacy, our continued defense of rights in all fora, not only in courtrooms, but virtually in any space where the cause of the people had to be defended, that would be most welcome. In terms of non-material, and I always tell this especially to lawyers, whenever we find ourselves under siege or under attack, any form of moral support, for example, the issuance of statements, urgent alerts, calling on the Philippine government to investigate the attack or to facilitate the domestic mechanisms for accountability, that's also most welcome for us. But then to support our clients, it's also important to join us in our various campaigns. And right now, we're seeing a lot of the deployment of the harmful rhetoric and narrative in relation to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. We are seeing this in the use of the term corned beef to describe the victims of the Toboso 19 killings. That is something that we need to fight together. So we need your help to memorialize the legacy of these victims who fought for their rights and to humanize them, to always to show anywhere in the world that these people were merely fighting for human dignity. And I think it will go a long way because that's a way for us to persuade other people to join our cause. So the disinformation in social media, that's one thing that we are trying to fight, but there are many other ways of supporting the grassroots movements on the ground.
What she said. Join a social movement. That's it. That's the most important part of it. As a lawyer, we provide specialized services, but as NUPL lawyers, we are under no illusion that the law can lead to fundamental change in society. At least that's what I believe. I recognize that. I recognize that the law does have its potential, but the functionality and potential of the law should not be equated with its nature. Remember, the law is like other social relations, the product of material conditions. And that means that it reflects the contradictions of that period. It means that it can be used as a weapon, but it also means that it can be used as an arena for struggle. That is the opportunity that we have as lawyers. We can use cases in order to expose the nature of the legal system, its failings, its pitfalls, but more importantly, the fact that the legal system is being used as a weapon of exploitation and repression. So you would be deluding yourself if you think that being a lawyer, simply engaging in practice and simply limiting yourself to legal practice, what is written in the law, can actually lead to fundamental change. Fundamental change comes from social movements. There is no example in history where such change was the result of the discussions of people within the corridors of power. It has to come from the people themselves. They have to assert their own power. They have to protect their own interests. They have to advance their own rights. And as lawyers, we can merely participate in that struggle. We can explain the legal contours of that struggle, but we cannot claim to be the most advanced elements of that struggle. So I hope, I hope that everyone here, there's one message that you can take away with you. It is that lawyers despite the accolades, despite the recognition, we can only move within the confines of the legal system. But it is the social movements themselves that can actually bring about the change that is necessary in order to address these structural issues that we are facing.
So we have time now for a few questions from the audience. So please encourage anyone to ask questions for our speakers here before they have to leave back to the Philippines to continue their work. So I don't know, I'll take us away. Here.
Wait lang.
Yes, yes.
Maraming salamat po for your talk today. Was really inspiring to hear from you because my parents keep telling me to become a lawyer, and I am trying to find the words to explain why I am pursuing the path of activism instead of pursuing that. So what you said was beautiful. Thank you so much. My mom is on the call, and I hope she really internalized that.
Yeah.
But my question actually falls to a recent statement from the Secretary of Defense, Teodoro, about the fact that he is in no mood to resume peace talks with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. And so I wanted to ask what is your position on that statement and your response really of why he's refusing to answer the calls of the movement for peace talks.
I think it's really a mistake to discard peace talks as the solution to armed conflict. We have to remember that the agreements that were entered into by the Philippine government and the National Democratic Front, there are around 10 of them. We're talking about agreements and joint statements. There are around 10 of them. They were the product of years of peace negotiations. And this actually resulted in, for example, a comprehensive agreement on the respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, or the CARIL. The CARIL recognizes that the conflict is rooted in socioeconomic conditions and injustices. And so the fact that both parties recognize that international law, human rights and humanitarian law is applicable is already a significant step forward. Now, there is another joint statement between the government and the NDF that explicitly recognized that that is only one of the steps in achieving peace in the Philippines. The others being entering into agreements that addresses the actual root causes, particularly socioeconomic issues, political issues. And then the final step would be disarmament, right? Or a cessation of hostilities. That is the process that was agreed upon by the Philippine government and the NDF way back in the 1990s. The problem is that the government probably recognized that after 9/11, you now have this narrative that you can use against armed movements. Counterterrorism. Everyone who has a firearm or has a gun who is advocating for a particular issue, regardless of the legitimacy of that issue or the legitimacy of the call, has to be branded or can be branded as a terrorist by that government. And so you have seen a shift. Now, there have been negotiations since 2001, but these frequently broke down until eventually the Duterte government decided that peace talks were not going to take place. There was a brief chance under the Marcos administration that it would resume, but the Marcos administration imposed one condition. It wanted a restart of the entire process, meaning it wanted to abrogate all of the previously signed agreements between the NDF and the government of the Philippines, including the recognition that international law applies, the recognition that international law must be respected. Now, this is a significant step backwards. there should be an effort to actually build upon these successes, because we have seen that peace negotiations can actually or have the potential to lead to reforms that, even if it does not upend society or change society fundamentally, can actually introduce positive reforms that can benefit the population. But unfortunately, as you said, Secretary Teodoro has said that peace talks are not going to take place or will not take place. Then that is simply, in my opinion, a mistake, and it is a step backwards.
Thank you. I don't know if there's more questions from the audience or online. I don't know if there's anything in the Zoom.
So earlier, I believe we met in 2023, now you remember, but hello. So your explanation of NTF LCAT is probably the clearest I've actually heard. I think it'd be good if everyone here learns from that. They can explain it in such a concise way. And I wanted to ask about NAPUPD and like also maybe how, if that alludes to like the US whole society approach too at all. So
So very briefly on LCAP and the UPD. LCAP is, for those who may not know, is the interagency task force that was created in order to address the insurgency led by the Communist Party of the Philippines. Now, the LCAP presents itself as engaging in efforts to address root causes. But in reality, it merely provides, you would refer to them as low impact, high publicity activities. LCAP and the armed forces facilitate civil military activities that involve haircuts, what's tuli in English?
Circumcision.
Pre-circumcision
Sometimes
for
dental
communities,
missions.
delivery of canned goods, delivery of relief goods that would last for just around a week. And they claim that these activities already resolve the root causes of the conflict. That is, not only is that stupid, but it is also deliberate misinformation. So, unfortunately, because of its control, because of its, of course, advantage in terms of media and, the government can present to the international community that there's actually progress. Now, with the UPD, it institutionalizes the approach of LCAP. It institutionalizes the whole of nation. And right now, counterinsurgency campaign in the Philippines is rooted in that particular approach. Okay? What is its effect? Apart from the fact that it does not actually resolve the root causes of conflict, it leads to significant red tagging. It leads to the militarization of communities, because a community can receive support from the government or additional funding only if it is cleared of New People's Army rebels or members of the NDF or their front organizations. Front organizations, as the government refers to them, would include NUPL. It would include Gabriela. It would include Anak Bayan and other organizations for marginalized groups. So the deliberate intent of these measures of UPD, of LCAP, of whole of nation is really to root out progressive civil society from the communities. It is not intended to target rebels themselves, because these operations take place not just in rural communities, but in urban places as well, where there has been no sightings, there were no sightings of the NPA. So you could really see that the objective of these activities is really to destroy civil society, or at the very least, progressive civil society.
Just to add a bit of information, you're aware of this founded here. It's called FACT, Filipino Americans Against Communist Terrorism. Under this NAPUPD program of the government, which is essentially a continuation of the past whole of nation approaches under the Duterte administration, the government is also creating its own fronts. These are organizations that claim to be completely independent, civil society, created, but really they are backed by the NTF-LCAC under especially its cluster called the International Cooperation, so that the tentacles really have extended from the Philippines to different countries. And now in the US, there's this organization that has actually petitioned the US government to look into you guys and, look into the possibility of blacklisting you, preventing you from entering the Philippines should you wish to go there because of your activities here that apparently they claim to be terrorist in nature or promoting terrorism or inciting to terrorism. So in the aftermath of the Toboso killings, one such organization called Bantay Kapayapaan was able to enter the site of the killings to conduct their so-called fact-finding mission, which is crazy because the people at the time, the displaced hundreds displaced families, were not even able to access their own homes. And yet there is this organization that claims to be, a CSO that is capable of conducting evidence gathering and preservation, that went around the area to claim that indeed all the dead are combatants, members of the New People's Army. So we have to be aware that there are such elements now in our midst, and that's part of the whole approach.
Maybe time for one more question.
I was just wondering, since you all were talking about misinformation in social media, if you could comment on, comment on whether you think that's being systematically weaponized by certain actors in the Philippines, or maybe even, from here, or like, because especially if it's from here, right? If you had a wish list for advocacy stateside in terms of like laws or regulations here governing, how Facebook does its business or companies like that, I'd love to hear that, since we're not most, but like many of us are voters here or know people in California, and maybe people who haven't spent much time in the Philippines don't understand the extent to which people get their news now from social media. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
I'm sure you're aware of Cambridge Analytica, how social media was used as a tool to engineer people's behavior during the elections. The same thing happened actually in the Philippines that led to the landslide victory of the Dutertes. And I would say the same thing happened that led to the victory of the Marcoses. I mean, they used historical revisionism and large-scale disinformation to be able to really have the power. The problem with regulation is that it is highly prone to abuse. And who will be arbiters of truth here? For sure, if there are regulations, it will be the government, and we cannot trust them to stand as those authorities that know the truth and are capable of policing content. So also there's the importance of hiding behind anonymity in terms of journalism. I mean, whistleblowers would benefit from not divulging or disclosing their identities online if they have valuable information to impart to the public. So I guess the best approach would be to engage with the platform itself, Meta. And we have had problems with Facebook plenty of times. In 2023, our Facebook page was taken down for a month because we, on the day of our anniversary, we held a rally calling for the repeal of the Anti-Terrorism Act and condemning the killing of a lawyer in the Cordillera. We appealed that decision to Meta. But according to them, we engage in this inauthentic behavior, apparently because we link our website and our statements posted on the website in our in some of our posts. So we appealed that decision, asked for a reversal, and unfortunately, our account was still taken down. In another instance, we had to ask for intercession from a digital rights group, which escalated our complaint quickly. But without their help, I mean, I think our complaint would be buried among the many others. So they're not able to quickly act on what we believe to be abuses. Abuse of the report mechanism, because we're not even violating any community standards. I think it's important that we formalize an engagement with them by which they can make sure that the rights of the account holders, those who post on Facebook, will be respected. And at the same time, should we become targets of disinformation, fake news, misogynistic remarks like my colleague Chrissy in relation to the ICC case, they would also do proactive measures to prevent that and to protect them.
I think you can also address it in two ways. First would refer to immediate regulations or immediate responses. Second would be long term. In terms of immediate, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines, these are supposedly independent experts. They already recognize the impact of red tagging or terror tagging. And they recognize that it facilitates the commission of human rights violations like EJKs and enforced disappearances and other arbitrary arrests, etc. Now, there are recommendations that these be regulated. Of course, we welcome that, but we also assert that the platforms where red tagging is taking place should also be responsible. For example, these corporations. The problem is that if you rely on these immediate responses or these measures, that would be short-sighted, because you would then be subject to regulations provided by a private corporation or regulations provided by government. As Josa said, it can be susceptible to abuse. So you have to also think long-term. And in my opinion, the only long-term solution is by changing the public's perception when it comes to these issues. And that has to be done through organizing work, grassroots organizing. There is no other remedy except changing the way people perceive the social issues that are confronting them. For example, in the Philippines, these incidents are taking place because there's an armed conflict. The armed conflict is taking place because there is injustice. Injustices take the form of extreme poverty, landlessness, deprivation of ancestral land, and a plethora of other issues. So you have to connect the specific violations with the broader social context. And you cannot do that through a single complaint or a single remedy that can be provided by a corporation. Corporations and governments are not the platform for that. Right? So it really boils down to the ability of the movement to mobilize as many people as possible and to change the narrative from the ground up. That is the only way you can address it.